Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, as many of you who are fond of reminding me, there is still one Checkmate Lincolnites video I have not done a reaction to yet, and that is the Were There Really Black Confederates? So that's the one we're going to dive into today. As always, the link is in the description to the original content. I'll also put links in the description and at the end of the video to my other Checkmate Lincolnites video reactions. So if you want to see any of those that maybe you missed or maybe you're new to the channel. Let's go ahead and dive into this one, see what it's all about.
Sure shaping up to be a grand old Christmas time. Much better than the Christmas of 1862. All I got that year was dysentery. And in the spirit of the season, I got you something.
I gotta say, I'm a little surprised that he didn't mention something about Christmas 1862 basking in the glory of the Confederate victory at Fredericksburg.
It's not a bomb, is it? No, no, no. It's a throwback to the old days. You remember, Christmases during the war. I know we normally give you Federals good Southern tobacco, but I heard you quit smoking recently, so... Wow, it's nicotine gum. That's actually really sweet, thank you. You know, I actually got you something too. It's way better than that chicory crap you guys drink.
So what he's talking about with chicory is that it was it's kind of a pretty typical thing that the Northerners didn't have access to a lot of tobacco because most of it was grown in the South. A lot of it's grown in Kentucky, which was a Union state that was divided, but and that the Confederates didn't have access to good coffee. And so they would make this chicory, which I think was made from like tree bark. It's horrible to think about, but I guess it worked.
Real coffee. Thank you, sir. And I went ahead and brewed a cup so you could enjoy it right away.
Why are they being so nice to each other?
Delicious. Oh, you're spiking it. Oh, okay.
Of course. A little more.
So that's a lot of booze. The whiskey purifies the excrement from the coffee. Much healthier that way.
And then he drinks the whole thing. Nice.
Amen. And Alex, to look this up, well, my ancestor was not only a great Confederate Civil War soldier of a hero. In his diary, and I was marching for Arkansas while we were covered in a...
This is brilliant. He sets the whole thing up to be a guy who's slurring his speech from drinking just so he can read this comment and have it actually make sense that he's saying it the way he is.
Union cavalry. We tried to stop them, but I bent down almost everything. My home is gone, my black friends is not slaves. I knew I know how to be found. My wife, Spotty, is as Chris and as black as I am. Us mellow being burnt and ready, just was fussing on them crowd of 18.
The comment really does not make any sense. What?
6-3. And if you don't believe me, why don't you go back to Washington or California or whatever Yankee state you please. Checkmate Lincolnites.
That was a great intro.
Come on, buddy. Sober up. We've got a new episode to film. Unless, of course, you're ready to finally concede that it was really about slavery after all. Never! It's so sad that Northerners still pretend the war was about slavery. They never want to talk about the tens of thousands of blacks who signed up to fight in the Confederate Army. Well, I don't know about Northerners, but historians have been perfectly willing to talk about black Confederates ever since that myth first originated in the 1970s. And they're in agreement. As the venerable Civil War historian Gary Gallagher put it,
the Black Confederate movement, which, as I said earlier, is demented, is an effort to get the Confederacy right on race retrospectively. And you just need to stop that. Anybody who's trying to do it, just stop it. Stop it right now.
And let's just stop for a second and Assume for 1 second that that was actually true. It's not. And I'm sure he's going to spend the video proving that it wasn't. But if it was, what does that change? That doesn't change any of the secession documents which talk about the right to own slaves as being the cornerstone for which they were fighting for. It doesn't change why they seceded. It doesn't change the fact that slavery was cemented into the Confederate Constitution, that all of this, that secession was precipitated on the fact that they felt that Lincoln's election was going to prevent them from being able to continue to expand slavery, which without expansion, slavery would eventually die, because eventually you'd have more and more votes in the Senate, votes in the House, in free states that would eventually get them enough to be able to outlaw slavery. And the Confederates saw the writing on the wall, and so that's why they started seceding. None of that changes, even if this is true. I don't know what the point is people are trying to make.
That historian is a revisionist and a liar. Over 114,000 black Confederate soldiers died defending their homes and families from a mostly white Yankee army.
So that would argue then, I mean, since you're talking 350,000 or so Confederates die in the war, so we're saying that a third of all the Confederate soldiers who died in the Civil War were black? Come on. Where do these people get this stuff from?
As this Facebook meme clearly demonstrates. Okay, well, everything about that is wrong, but it is true that tens of thousands of black men did accompany Confederate armies and supported their war effort. It's just that, don't say it, the majority of these men, he's gonna say it, were slaves, either impressed by the Confederate government to perform manual labor or brought by their wealthy owners to war to carry out menial tasks in camp, like cooking, cleaning clothes, or transporting supplies.
In fact, if you look at the negotiations for the surrender of the city of Vicksburg, which was not an unconditional surrender like Fort Donelson was, you see that Pemberton, who's commanding the Confederate garrison, initially attempts to get Grant to agree to a scenario in which all of the men, the Confederates, can keep their personal property, which of course meant keep their slaves, and Grant wasn't going to go for that.
Provisions. A few free black men enlisted in the Confederate Army as cooks, teamsters, and musicians, but they were certainly not soldiers. Their white brethren would have made that distinction abundantly clear to them. After all, for most of the war, it was forbidden by Confederate law for black men to serve as soldiers. Yes, in 1861, a law was passed in the Confederate Congress that banned slaves from enlisting. Supply issues were chronic, and the weapons were needed for white soldiers. Despite the eagerness of the black soldiers, a decision had to be made. Consequently, the black soldiers decided to aid the white soldiers in the camps, serving as clerks, cooks, mending clothing, as well as...
So because the Confederate Army would not allow them to enlist, but they were so behind the cause anyway that they just went and did whatever tasks they were permitted to do. Oh my gosh, these people are nuts.
Caring for the wounded and sick. You're just making shit up now, aren't you? Yeah, you got me. Hey. Still, as a New Orleanian, you ought to know better. Here's a photograph of the 1st Louisiana Native Guard.
Those are Union soldiers.
Black Confederates who volunteered to serve in New Orleans in the spring of 1861. That's not the 1st Louisiana Native Guard. That's the 25th Regiment of United States Colored Troops in a photograph taken in Philadelphia. That image, by the way, was subsequently used as a recruitment poster to try to encourage Northern blacks to enlist in the Union Army. But you are right. The 1st Louisiana Native Guard was an all-black militia unit in Confederate New Orleans. But they're the exception that proves the rule. As I've said repeatedly in my many videos about New Orleans history, race relations were different here than in the rest of the South. During slavery, we had a large and unusually prosperous population of free people of color, many of whom were...
And remember, New Orleans is by far the largest city in the Confederacy, and so it's natural that freedmen who remained in the South, especially in that part of the South, would flock to New Orleans, where there would be jobs, where there would be other people like them that they could congregate with.
Mixed race and had family ties to local white aristocrats. And lots of them also owned slaves. Yes, exactly. So we really shouldn't be terribly surprised that they volunteered their services to the Confederacy. Besides, there was a precedent here. Free black militias had fought alongside Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans. Despite all that, the state still stymied their efforts to serve in a combat role. Louisiana law limited membership in the militia to free white males capable of bearing arms. And all the 1st Louisiana did was go out on parade a few times. And though surviving a New Orleans parade can often make you feel like a combat veteran, this unit never saw any real action. They were quickly disbanded by the state government, only to be reformed in April of 1862 when the United States Navy was threatening New Orleans.
Yep.
But after Confederate General Mansfield Lovell abandoned the city, the 1st Louisiana gave up without a fight. Interestingly, those same men then offered their services to Benjamin Butler, the military governor of the Union occupiers of New Orleans. As Butler's biographer James Parton explained,
So General Butler called on Africa, not upon the slaves, but upon the free colored men of the city, whom General Jackson had enrolled in 1814. He sent for several of the most influential of this class, and conversed freely with them upon this project. He asked them why they had accepted service under the Confederate government, which was set up for the distinctly avowed purpose of holding in eternal slavery their brethren and kindred. They answered that they had not dared to refuse, that they had hoped, by serving the Confederates, to advance a little nearer in equality with whites,
go.
and that they longed to throw the weight of their class into the scale of the Union, and only asked an opportunity to show their devotion to the cause with which their own dearest hopes were identified. The general took them at their word.
So this was not about agreeing with the Confederate cause and siding with them. This was about proving their manhood, proving that they could do everything that a white soldier could do. And so when the Union takes over New Orleans, they're still willing to do exactly that, but now it's for a cause they can actually believe in.
though General Butler took these guys at their word, we probably shouldn't. The mixed-race Free People of Color of New Orleans had always viewed themselves as superior to and distinct from slaves and full-blooded blacks. So it's very likely that they were just telling Butler what he wanted to hear. These guys left no written records of this event, so their motivations will probably always remain a mystery. But historical context can give us some clues. New Orleans was the wealthiest and most strategically important city in the entire South, and the Confederate government had relegated pitifully few resources in manpower or materiel to defend it.
Yeah, it's the first major city in the South to fall. Well, maybe the second after Nashville, but you know, it falls without a single soldier. It's just the Navy shows up. They run past the two forts that are defending the Mississippi River, Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip, and they take New Orleans pretty easily, and they hold it for the rest of the war.
Though General Lovell would be blamed for basically allowing the Union Navy to capture the city, realistically, there was nothing he could have done to stop them.
Yeah.
And after the occupation, even diehard secessionists had lost all hope that the stainless banner would fly over the Crescent City ever again. Faced with this hard truth, the men of the 1st Louisiana may have realized that they needed to kiss Butler's ring if they had any hope in maintaining their privileged social status.
I see what he's trying to do there, and he's trying to kind of see the other side of this. I'm not 100% sure I agree that they were just telling Butler what they wanted to hear, but that's certainly a possibility, and it's not something I would strongly disagree with.
That may be true for that one regiment. But how do you explain the photographs and records of blacks in the Confederate Army? Don't that prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the army of our great and glorious Confederate States was as diverse as a college admissions photo? For instance, here we see Sergeant Andrew Chandler of the 44th Mississippi Infantry, together with his family servant Silas. As you can see, Silas is armed and wearing a uniform. And look at how closely the men are sitting. Their legs are touching. How can you deny the existence of black Confederate soldiers when faced with this overwhelming evidence?
Let's get one thing straight here. Silas Chandler was a slave. Not a servant, a slave. That photograph was probably taken in August of 1861. Andrew Chandler, the 17-year-old son of a wealthy plantation owner, had just enlisted as a private in the Confederate Army and decided to take Silas with him to war. The weapons they're holding are almost certainly studio props. It was common for young volunteers after enlisting to have, like, tough guy photos taken of them. It was also common for plantation owners to take a slave or two with them to war. Many of those slaves wore some kind of uniform.
And it's important to point out as well that the wealthiest plantation owners didn't have to go off to war because they were exempt. If you had a certain number of people that you owned in slaves, you didn't have to fight.
Just as they had done in the Mexican War. But you are right about one thing, Johnny. Their pose is unusual.
Yeah.
Most soldiers who are photographed with their camp slaves place themselves in positions of unquestionable dominance. This one definitely feels more buddy-buddy.
He's a 17-year-old kid, though.
This is because they were the best of friends. Silas was free to travel from the plantation in Mississippi to wherever Andrew was. Andrew wrote home on the 31st of August, 1862, that the Federals might take Silas. I greatly fear another raid. Don't let them catch Silas. Be sure to write when Silas gets home. Andrew was severely wounded at the Battle of Chickamauga. The doctors were prepared to amputate his leg, but Silas refused to allow them to perform the operation. Instead, he took a piece of gold to buy whiskey, which he used to buy a bottle of whiskey to bribe the surgeons for...
Here's the problem, and I'm sure he'll probably point this out, and I point this out on all of these videos. If you desperately look, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of soldiers on each side, right? I mean, a couple million on the Union side. At least 500,000 on the Confederate side fought, probably more than that. You're going to be able to find a few stories like this, and even this story is not the great defense of there being black Confederates that the Sons of Confederate Veterans think it is. But even if it's true, even if that's the case, a couple of stories here and there do not prove your argument. They're exceptions, not the rule.
Andrew's release. He carried his master on his back and loaded him onto a boxcar bound for Atlanta and better medical care. The two remained friends for the rest of their lives. Well, that's bullshit, but it is true that after Andrew was injured at Chickamauga, Silas helped him get back to the family farm. Because he loved him. He may have. We don't know for a fact that he didn't.
Yeah.
But I think a much more likely explanation would be Silas's love for his own wife and newborn son,
who were back at the plantation. So, listen, it's important to note that the relationship between families that owned slaves and their slaves was sometimes a pretty good one. Let me clarify. They got along well, and sometimes there was even love there. You can't really say it was a good relationship because they were still owning those people, and those people were still not free to leave. So there's an inherent inequality that exists there. But it was sometimes a good relationship, and you might have even had a situation where a 17-year-old kid who's a son of plantation owners had a great relationship, even a friendship with one of the slaves that his parents owned. That's absolutely possible.
Who were enslaved back at the plantation in Mississippi. When you have the safety of your family to think about, then you do what your master says.
Yep.
If he says, come to war with me, you go. If he says, hold this shotgun and pose for a photo with me, you do it.
And you know, it's so easy for us in 2023 to try and justify it and say, well, why would you do that? Why would you go along with that? Why wouldn't you fight back the first chance you got? Well, it's easy to say that now when we're not in that situation, but when you are in the institution of slavery, when that's all you've ever known, when your family is still enslaved, you're thinking very differently.
If Silas had come home without Andrew, or God forbid, escaped to the Yankees, who knows what would have happened to his family. We have basically no wartime records written by camp slaves themselves, so everything we know about them is filtered through the perspective of their masters.
Yep.
And even though stories of faithful slaves firing at Yankees or carrying their wounded masters back to safety were incredibly popular in Confederate newspapers, any close reading of our sources reveals that these masters were downright deluded about the extent of their bondsmen's loyalty. Camp slaves ran away all the time, especially when the Confederate Army was in enemy territory or operating in close proximity to United States forces.
If you knew there was a U.S. Army nearby, if you had nothing to lose, like there's no family back home, there's nothing keeping you there, you're going to take your chances.
In the summer of 1864, during Jubal Early's raid of Pennsylvania, the slave of one Captain Robert Park escaped. Park later wrote that
he must have been enticed away or forcibly detained by some Negro worshiper, as he had always been prompt and faithful, and seemed much attached to me.
I can't understand why he ran. We got along so well. He was always faithful to me. Now we're in Pennsylvania, and somebody must have just talked him into it. Come on, dude.
Like, it never occurred to this man that his slave may have just been feigning his affections, biding his time, waiting for an opportunity to get the fuck out of there.
You're derailing the conversation, Billy Yank. I don't deny that there were camp slaves. What I'm saying is that there were also black Confederate soldiers.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Oh, I have evidence, namely the many photographs of black rebels at veterans events after the war.
We even have records of their pensions. Yes, in the early 20th century, some former camp slaves did receive state pensions. But if you're going to use those pensions as evidence for the existence of black Confederates, then you're in for a shock. The pension applications make it very clear that these former camp slaves were not considered veterans, with lines like, "What was the number of the regiment in which your owner served?" The black men at Confederate veterans events were also former camp slaves. Again, it wasn't terribly unusual for camp slaves to wear uniforms.
Oh, come on! You can't weasel your way out of this one. Do you not believe the sensible and true avouch of your own eyes? If we Confederates loved racism so much, why did we invite these black men to reunions? Why did we adorn them in medals and honors? It's right there in black and white.
You know, Johnny, it's really amazing. You're so knowledgeable about the Civil War.
I ought to be. I fought in it.
You and your fellow Lost Causers could rattle off the entire order of battle at Lookout Mountain by heart. You could tell me exactly how to hook up the shoulder boards on a general's frock. You know the number of mini balls that can fit into a standard issue cartridge box. So it's shocking how unbelievably ignorant you are of all of Southern history outside of those 4 little years of rebellion. We shouldn't be at all surprised that former camp slaves were welcomed and honored at Confederate veterans events, especially from the 1920s on. It was the height of Jim Crow, and an important justification for segregation was that black people were being oppressed for their own good.
Yeah, the whole separate but equal thing. Listen, if you don't think people actually thought that way, look at guys like Woodrow Wilson, who actually thought that segregation was beneficial to black people. It's baffling stuff.
Unlike the Lost Cause myth of today, which tries to paint the Confederacy as some sort of egalitarian paradise, the Lost Cause myth of the early 20th century maintained that blacks had been better off as slaves, and that the best hope for black Americans going forward was for them to defer to white authority. But during World War I, black Southern soldiers had been treated more or less as equals in Europe, and saw firsthand that a desegregated society was possible.
And so they go over to Europe. Units, this isn't a Southern unit, but 369th, the Harlem Hellfighters. They go over to Europe. They're probably the best soldiers in the American Expeditionary Force. They're attached to French divisions because they couldn't fight with the Americans side by side and be treated as equals and be given those opportunities. They're given French equipment, French helmets. And they think that because they've done so well that when they come home, they're going to be treated as equals. And then they come back and find out that really nothing changed back home.
Consequently, upon returning home, they aggressively fought for their rights. Many white Southerners fought back, both with violence and propaganda. Not every black Southerner was quite so radical. In fact, their politics were pretty neatly divided along generational lines. Younger black people were avowed agitators. Older black people, including many former slaves, were content not to rock the boat. Their deference gave the white elite the exact ammunition they needed to counter the activist narrative. So when former camp slaves appeared at Confederate veterans events, they were placed front and center as ideal examples of well-being.
Look at how you know they're pointing to them as, again, showing how wonderful they are and how committed to equality they are while simultaneously fighting for segregation.
Blacks. Speaking of pensions, a 1921 article in the Confederate Veteran magazine noted that
a new feature in the pension appropriation of Tennessee makes an allowance for pensions to the faithful Negroes who were in the war with their masters and served them to the end. Doubtless other states of the South will make similar provision for their old Negroes, whose loyalty under the circumstances showed a fine sense of honor, not apparent in later
generations of the race. That's a direct refutation of these young, who do they think they are, upstarts who are trying to demand full equality.
Of the race.
Many of these black men also wanted to lay claim to the sense of martial masculinity that the white people of their generation enjoyed. And we can kind of see why that makes sense. We just put ourselves in their shoes for a second. We can really understand that the...
Oh boy.
Lord, give me the strength to resist the Yankee invader, the violator of our homes and firesides. Let me destroy him with facts and logic, Lord. I am your humble servant.
Little throwback to Gods and Generals.
I know that.
Oh, no. It's Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Is that really you? It's a Christmas miracle.
Yes, it's me. But I wasn't really born on Christmas. It's a vile pagan carnival, and everyone who celebrates it is going to hell.
Is it my day to be with you?
True, he wasn't born on Christmas.
If so, I come to you with all the joy in my heart.
No, Johnny. I have come to answer your prayers. Take this. It is a book of primary sources to counter Billy's arguments.
So says.
Yes. Now go, my son. Go boldly into the combat. And remember, Catholics and Quakers worship the devil and should be killed.
I'll remember, Lord.
You are wise and strong, and I am very proud of you. Goodbye.
Oh boy, this should be interesting.
Neatly with the early 20th century's popular image of the Confederacy.
This guy has no idea what he is talking about. There were black Confederates, and no, they weren't just cooks or camp hands. From most accounts I've read, they were riflemen. Sources. First, on account by Dr. Lewis Steiner, the inspector of the U.S. Sanitary Commission. In his diary, he described observing our brave boys entering Frederick, Maryland in the invasion of 1862.
This morning, the rebel army began to move from our town. The most liberal calculations could not give them more than 64,000 men.
So, first of all, they had maybe half that in the invasion of the North, but yeah.
Over 3,000 Negroes must be included in this number. These were clad in all kinds of uniforms. Most of the Negroes had arms, rifles, muskets, sabers, bowie knives, dirks, etc. They were supplied, in many instances, with knapsacks, haversacks, canteens, etc., and were manifestly an integral portion of the Southern Confederacy Army.
Steiner was right. Slaves were an integral portion of the Confederate Army. What he's observing here are camp slaves performing one of their many functions, carrying their master's weapons and equipment
Unloaded.
on a long march.
Next, on account from one of Badan's sharpshooters, who saw a black Confederate at the siege of Yorktown, Virginia.
For a considerable time during the siege, the enemy had a Negro rifle shooter in their front who kept up a close fire on our men, and although the distance was great, yet he caused more or less annoyance by his persistent shooting. At one occasion, while at the advanced posts with the detail, the rider with his squad had an opportunity to note the skill of this determined darky with his well-aimed rifle.
Yeah, there are a few accounts by some United States soldiers that claim the exact same thing. Even if they correctly identified these soldiers as black, which at the distances we're talking about is a big if, it still wouldn't prove the existence of black Confederate soldiers. All it would demonstrate is that some camp slaves picked up their rifles and shot at Yankees, which is entirely believable, because some slaves were genuinely loyal, and in the heat of battle, who knows what could happen.
And finally, in September of 1861, Frederick Douglass, of all people, wrote in his own newspaper that
it is now pretty well established that there are at the present moment many colored men in the Confederate Army doing duty as real soldiers. There were such soldiers at Manassas, and they're probably still there.
How would Douglass know? Was he at Manassas? And you're ignoring the context here. Douglass was using these rumors of armed camp slaves to try to drum up support in the North for arming black regiments. As he goes on to say.
Yeah, exactly. He's arguing, listen, the Confederates are using them, why aren't we? That's the whole point here. And listen, I think what he's getting at with all of this, and we need to understand, is were there blacks who wore Confederate uniforms? Yes, absolutely. Most of them in a servant capacity because they came along with their owners. Were there occasionally black men who picked up a gun and started shooting? Yes. Was the Confederate Army enlisting black soldiers? No. At the very, very end of the war, you'll see Robert E. Lee push for that as a condition of freedom, that they offer enlistment to black soldiers. But up until then, absolutely not. In fact, remember that the Confederate government had, number one, passed a law saying they couldn't do that. Number two, they passed a law that said that any Union soldiers who were black, who were in Union uniforms that were captured, would either be executed or sent back into slavery.
Say in that same article,
rising above vulgar prejudice, the slaveholding rebel accepts the aid of the black man as readily as that of any other. If a bad cause can do this, Why should a good cause
There you
be
go.
less
That's why.
wisely conducted? We insist upon it that one black regiment in such a war as this is, without being any more brave and orderly, would be worth to the government more than two of any other, and that while the government continues to refuse the aid of colored men, thus alienating them from the national cause and giving the rebels the advantage of them, it will not deserve better fortunes than it has thus far experienced.
He was less concerned about the veracity of those reports as he was about their political usefulness.
Yep.
And in any event, the idea that hearsay from Union soldiers are reliable sources is absurd, and you wouldn't even be bringing that up if there was a single piece of Confederate documentation to substantiate your claims. You know, there actually were black Confederate soldiers.
Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. He admitted it. I think we're done here.
But only after the Confederate Congress had allowed the military to enlist black soldiers in March of 1865.
When the war was
just
over.
3 weeks before the surrender at Appomattox. It was a desperate, last-ditch attempt to avoid defeat, but it didn't work. The Confederacy was doomed, in part due to the 200,000 black men who were already serving in the Union Army.
Yep.
By the end of the war, black soldiers made up 10% of the Union Army's manpower, and had suffered more than 10,000 combat casualties. There were only ever a few hundred black Confederate soldiers in the spring of 1865, and they barely saw any action. And despite the public endorsement of Robert E. Lee, the idea to arm black men had been extremely controversial in the Confederacy for the better part of a year. The idea was first proposed by General Patrick Cleburne, who wrote in 1863 that
The measure will at one blow strip the enemy of foreign sympathy and assistance, and transfer him to the south. It'll dry up 2 of his 3 sources of recruiting. It'll take from his Negro army the only motive it could have to fight against
Got
the
the
South.
Irish accent going on there. Claiborne, probably one of the best Confederate generals, killed in that horrible charge at Franklin late in the war.
And it will probably cause much of it to desert over to us. The immediate effect of the emancipation and enrollment of Negroes in the military strength of the South would be to enable us to have armies numerically superior to those of the North, and a reserve of any size we might think necessary. It would instantly remove all the vulnerability, embarrassment, and inherent weakness which result from slavery.
Aha! A woke Confederate general. You seriously expect me to believe that the man who wrote that fought for slavery?
he was one of the better ones for sure, but Cleburne by no means spoke for the Confederate leadership. In the first days of 1864, he shared his proposal with his commanding officer, Joseph E. Johnston. Johnston dismissed it, out of hand, and actually ordered Cleburne to stop spreading those dangerous notions. Nevertheless, a copy of the proposal ended up on the desk of Jefferson Davis. He actually also ordered it suppressed. But as the tide of war began turning against the South, Davis warmed to the idea, and in November of 1864 presented a watered-down version of it to Congress. Congress was furious. They rejected it. But the whole thing sparked off this huge and incredibly divisive public debate. For many Confederates, arming blacks betrayed the very cause for which they were fighting.
The moment you resort to Negro soldiers, your white soldiers will be lost to you. The day you make soldiers of them is the beginning or the end of the revolution. If slaves will make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong.
Exactly. There is the crux of it, right? Because if they show that they can be good soldiers, which is what you would need them to be if you're going to let them fight for your side, then they show you that they are equal with white men, and you can't allow any opportunity for them to prove that they are as equal as anybody else.
In my opinion, the worst calamity that could befall us would be to gain our independence by the valor of our slaves instead of our own. The day that the Army of Virginia allows a Negro regiment to enter their lines as soldiers, they will be degraded, ruined, and disgraced.
Of course, you'd think that in all of the Confederate records we have of the slave enlistment debate, including thousands of newspaper articles, somebody would have confirmed what Frederick Douglass and others had claimed, namely that there were already blacks serving as soldiers in the Confederate Army. But nobody did. To the contrary, they vehemently denied it. A Richmond war clerk named John Jones, who worked closely with the Davis administration throughout the war, had this to say about Northern rumors that there were black soldiers in the Confederate Army.
This is utterly untrue. We have no armed slaves to fight for us.
So the reason why he's making this argument, and I'm really glad that he is he's showing the dangers of taking a single source that has no corroboration whatsoever, or very little, and trying to make an argument with it. Because, you know, just for example, you take a crime that happens and you talk to eyewitnesses, you're going to get 5 different stories of what happened. And if you pull one of those eyewitness accounts out and say, this is exactly what happened, while ignoring the other 4 to make your argument, you're not proving anything. And so he's making an excellent point that Frederick Douglass talking about that, absent other corroborating evidence that shows that what Douglass said was true, we have to assume that the more likely scenario is the one that he's presenting here, which is that Douglass was trying to make a point to try and get the enlistment of black soldiers in the North to take place.
Shit. Oh, I almost forgot. I actually got you something else. Oh? It's a big one.
Oh boy.
Oh Lord, do my eyes deceive? A War of Northern Aggression themed chess set. Wow, there's old Moss Robert himself and President Davis.
Yeah, Davis is the king and Lee is the queen. But, you know, Davis should really be the queen because of that whole rumor about how he was captured wearing one of his wife's dresses.
Unfounded slander. Oh, and look, here's the tyrant Lincoln. He must be the king, and Grant the Butcher is the queen. Now that is fitting, considering how Grant played the role of Desdemona in their production of Othello at that fort out west before the Mexican War.
Yeah, okay.
And for the role, he dressed as a woman.
Yeah, I get the joke. Yeah.
And the rook's got little cannons on him and everything. Thank you, Billy Yank. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you too, my friend. Fancy a game?
Let's do it. I'll whip you harder than at first Manassas.
Why don't you move first? After all, you did start the war.
Ha ha, very funny.
That was really good. He did a great job with that one, and that was good stuff. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comment section below. Check out some of the other Checkmate Lincolnite videos if you haven't seen those already. I'll put the links there and up on the screen as well. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.